The Cliques of Nyland Revolution season has begun in earnest, and at the forefront of everyone's minds is Grand Prix Estrathe. The first monthly tournament of our new format is quickly approaching. Decklist submissions close at midnight Eastern Standard Time as the weekend rolls over into this coming Monday. So a lot of people are trying to figure out what the best deck to bring to the GP will end up being. Hopefully, this video can help prepare you and help you figure out what to play for this event, as well as maybe sabotage myself by revealing the deck I'm looking at. Before we dive in, as always, the link to the Custom Magic Discord server is in the description below. If you're on the fence about whether or not to compete, I highly recommend it, even if you're newer to the format, as the stakes are relatively low and the opportunities to get more familiar with Revolution are abundant. Before we can dive into decks and tournament prep, there were 4 more major changes released in a pre-GP patch earlier in the week. We should go over those so that there's a clearer sense of what the format looks like going into the tournament. I'd initially written off Black Tie Gala for the most part, but a community member named Filthy Casual 564 figured out that with a disc flipper in play, Black Tie Gala could enable infinite treasures, infinite mana, infinite artifact enter triggers, and even dig deeper to an outlet for any of those things if needed. Though their deck never made it into the decklist's channel for the community, 4-Color Gala was enough of a shock to the curator's expectations of opening week that they've issued a slight rework to Disc Flipper. Not so slight, in fact, as once each turn severely limits the card's playability, even if it still makes a couple treasures each turn rotation with Black Tie Gala. Unfortunately, I think the Disc Flipper is largely dead for the format now. More news in the treasure field. Undercroft Poisoner and Keeper of the Scale are both receiving additional adjustments beyond the ones they've received in the past. Neither of these cards looked how they did when they first entered the format, but even where they'd been prior to this week looked really powerful in the face of everything else lining up in the format. To curb their ability to pay off treasure decks with minimal investment, Undercroft Poisoner is shedding a point of toughness and now requires an additional mana to make a food token. This in its own wouldn't necessarily kill Poisoner's playability, it's much more fragile and that food ability is far less relevant, but the next change is really going to be what hurts it. Keeper of the Scale has suffered a much less kind fate. It no longer plays into treasure synergies in any capacity. It still does a little bit of work with Poisoner on the basis of helping its swarm of rats gain death touch and scale over time, but without the Poisoner being able to capitalize on treasures that it makes, the ability for these 2 cards to create that swarm is vastly diminished. Veterans who've explored the format quite a bit may recognize this counter-granting ability from another card from Theros Age of Trax named Evridiki, and might be wondering what's happening to that card with Keeper of the Scale getting changed. Well, Evridiki has lost her counter-granting ability, and instead is now gaining the treasure ability from Keeper of the Scale. She's also shed a point of toughness in exchange for a less taxing mana cost. I don't think this is a huge loss in any area. Mono Green Devotion was flush with good options, so she was never really a notable 2-drop for that deck, and the treasure generation here makes her a card worth considering in her own right. I can't exactly say she's stellar, but as a more splashable mono green card, there are some synergies with the keyword granting effect of Nylon, and the format also just straight up has 2 different 1-drops that can enter with Death Touch to get the engine rolling faster. I wouldn't say I'm optimistic about Evridiki at the moment, but she's not out of the question forever. Moving on to deck lists, we ought to ask what decks are actually performing well in the current field of the format. Unfortunately, some of this data can be difficult to draw conclusions from, largely as some of the deck lists we have to look at predate the GP changes. However, there are still a good few decks we can look to glean some information about what is and isn't working in the format. Let's start off by looking at the raw stats. As of the writing of this script, across Friday and Saturday of this sort of weekend before the format, there are 15 decks that have made it through a league run with a record of 4 wins or better, but only one of these decks has actually landed a run with 5 wins and 0 losses. Of these published deck lists, 8 different archetypes are represented, piloted to victory by 8 different players. Some of these results are a bit skewed, however, because of the 15 deck lists found here, 9 of them were posted by just 2 players, with each of the remaining 6 players only getting a single deck list in each. Let's take a look at what these 2 players are playing first that have gotten to them to their consistent records. Caillou102 was the first player this month to log a league run with a 4-1 deck list, piloting a black colorless build to grind the opponent out of resources and either beat them down through the old Undercroft Poisoner and Keeper of the Scale engine, or grind the opponent to dust with Tithe to the Machine. Chronicle of Extinction, Field Test, and Planeswalkers really helped tie the whole thing together. Even with Poisoner and Keeper getting changed, there's definitely an appeal to black, colorless, or other similar low-color decks that can lean on powerful colorless matters synergies, as the access to colorless utility lands like Time-Worn Crags and Court of Miracles help the deck have more use out of their mana base beyond just fixing. I'm not sure how well a deck like this could cleanly pivot around the pre-GP changes, but I think it's certainly an avenue to consider. After that first run, Kai started putting up results with a 5-color control deck, leaning on the combination of Golden Age and Redeveloped Cityscape to quickly assemble the colors needed to play powerful finishers or the needed pieces of interaction to get the job done. Knowing that any risk of the game going long can be reasonably handled through Planeswalkers and the value generation presented by Harmony. Add in relevant pieces of mana fixing like Gubernatorial Fundraiser and Manifest the Light Veins, and a trio of get your wishes to either find the right card for the right situation, search up a needed Golden Age, or even just slam an instant speed coup d'etat. 5-color control has proven a force to be reckoned with, as it is one of the 2 most prominent archetypes in the decklist channel just through Caillou playing it alone. He pushed 3 4-win league runs across this past weekend, and just as of today, Saturday afternoon, he's posted his 4th 4-1 run, with the only change from the list you see here on screen being 1 fewer Iris Pledge and Crown Guard ban in the sideboard to make room for some Soul Guide Lanterns. This is a deck you can watch in action played against me by Caillou in the last match of my most recent league run, at the info card at the top right of your screen now, and I wouldn't be surprised for all of us to see plenty of people queuing this deck up this month. The other player who's seen a good deal of success so far this month is Lilosar, who has put up 2 results each with 2 separate strategies, though each of their decks has its differences. Liz's first 2 runs were different versions of their Wake Up Call Pulsing Soundsea artifact deck that had seen some success back in July. The first deck list was a green-white shell with similarities to those July deck lists, but this list, from their second run, instead opted for black as its second color, opening the door to use Chronicle of Extinction and Tithe to the Machine as top-end pieces to deal with the opponent and grind out the game respectively, as well as grabbing some extra card draw through Deadly Dispute and Product of Nepotism, and a few relevant sideboard pieces, though those Poisoners look a little worse for wear now. Beyond that one sideboard change, though, this strategy looks very capable of dropping game-shaping pieces before the opponent can meaningfully react. And, with the most relevant threats largely getting to circumvent a sorcery speed coup d'etat, this certainly seems promising against Golden Age, so long as a timely work safety violation doesn't strip away everything you have. After their wake-up call decks came their attempts to jam some games with Extraction Mission. Their first pass at the strategy saw an Integrate package, hoping to build up treasure tokens to eventually whittle the opponent to nothing with Lure into Lunacy, a strategy that proved quite effective and only barely stumbled in the one match that it lost. You can see that version of their deck in action in my most recent league run as well. That info card should be on screen now. Their second pass shed the Integrate package and some more synergy-dependent cards like Devoted Lackeys in favor of better standalone cards like Lurking Virkalakis and Tithe to the Machine, aiming to have a better plan for grinding out the game while still working with the high damage potential of Skofos Conqueror and Extraction Mission. I haven't seen this version in action, and there are some slightly awkward elements such as the low colorless land count for making Tithe to the Machine stick, but in talking with Liv, they've said that the colorless source count wasn't too much of an issue thanks to how well the deck can dig through cards, either pitching an uncastable Tithe or finding the Patisserie to help it stick when needed. This isn't the last we'll talk about Extraction Mission, but for now, let's get on to the individual players and deck archetypes. If you care for video spoilers, plug your ears because this next archetype is something I have played recently. Chittering Gargantua and company have gotten 2 successful league runs so far, one piloted by Nylon designer Stasis, and the other piloted by yours truly. We'll look at Stasis's list here, as I think despite my success, I believe their list is closer to the optimal look of the deck. Get Writhlings and Zigzags Apexes into the graveyard, eat them with Chittering Gargantua and Scrapyard Mecha. The plan looks pretty simple on the surface. However, Stasis's approach sees the application of Deep Treader and Arcanist and Ignited Soul weaponized to ensure a consistent turn 2 indulgence trigger for Feast of Whispered Knives. This diversity of win conditions, graveyard value and big creatures alongside one of the format's most notorious enchantments at this point, coupled alongside the early rate at which a lot of these can become problems for the opponent, presents a lot to be desired here. I found some success with the Red Splash for Garen, but ultimately I think the pure blue-black angle is the best one for the graveyard strategy here. If you're giving this deck some serious consideration, stick around. This is one we'll come back to in a bit. Speaking of decks on everyone's radar, Lilosaur wasn't the only player to tear through the league with a black-red extraction mission deck. PTM was the first player to get this strategy into the decklist channel, though unfortunately, this is one that's really hurting for the changes that made to the Poisoner Keeper package. There are some ideas here absent from Liz versions that have posted and could be worth some consideration, though. Tormenting Light Rider is a solid piece to push damage through, and Lit has avoided using Extraction Ritual themselves, whereas PTM put it on stack for 3 cards while sacrificing a Lackeys to double the draw in one of his matches. As I mentioned before, the mission plan had me biting my nails through my last league run, and this version of the deck was the one to take a match off of Stasis's list that we just talked about. So the Lean Sacrifice deck definitely has a lot going for it. Moving on to decks with only a single big league run under their belt thus far, we should start with the biggest outlier. White-Blue Tempo is the sole deck so far this month to go the full 5-0. There's a lot to like here. Solid creatures, solid disruption, even a Gaze Upon Civilization to cheat mana costs and help you keep some mana up for interaction. Unfortunately, I'm rather inexperienced with this archetype, so I can't say if there are ways the deck could or should be tweaked for the tournament, but if you're looking to slip under the competition, this is a proven winner. The final 2 decks to talk about here are stuff with more memorable staying power in the format. Though not quite the beast it was before nerfs to Afara, Benthlos, and Founding of the 12 cut some of the deck's most potent play patterns, and rotation saw a powerful enchantment removal piece depart the format, Enchantress has still got some very solid things going for it, especially with Nyland giving the strategy more of a reason to splash in black. As mentioned before, Feast is notorious for how quickly it can dominate games, and Afara is a consistent means of enabling Feast turn by turn. Couple this with the fact that some great pieces of interaction in the format, such as Omen of Deception, Seal Away, Banish to the Isle, and Omen of Slaughter, all draw a card off of Afara, and there's plenty to like here. In speaking to all who wander about their thoughts on the list, they also feel that the deck is well positioned at the moment and spoke to how well Fovius, Adai, and the Kanai Stone in particular performed as stable one-time mana investment card draw engines, both for their ability to keep card flow high deep into the game and their consistency with keeping Feast of Whispered Knives active. But at the same time, as their run wasn't up against many aggro decks, they mentioned that Feast actually underperformed in their run. They advise a lot of patience if you're looking to play this deck yourself. Many of the games they lost were due to a result of them tapping out for a value piece at a bad time, underestimating their opponent's damage output, and paying the heavy price for it. Finally, they've recommended some caution around Banish to the Isle, and other similar enchantment removal pieces. With how much work safety violation is running around the format right now, anything temporarily removed by an enchantment is liable to return at a moment's notice. So if you can choose between hard removal like Chromatic Rift versus Seal Away or Banish to the Isle, the permanent removal effect may be a higher priority to play on for the long run. With Shangfa, Ifara, and Stormscraper all dodging work safety, though, this deck still looks like it's very favored against the Golden Age decks. Finally, in our winning deck lists of the week is Kilgaris's Enchantment aggro deck, leaning on some solid early aggressive pieces like Sparks of a Revolution, Melon, Ifara's Messenger, and Hero in the Making, while building up to classic Age of Trax finishers like Electy's King of Akros, Basillo Lion of Valor, or even Basillo's Blessing to pile a ton of power onto your creatures before your opponent is ready to deal with them. Add in the life gain package between Basillo, Zakros Decree, and Prosperity Project, offering a way to stabilize against the high damage decks like Sacrifice and Self-Mill, as well as Chosen of Heliod helping your creatures punch through gummed up boards. There's a lot of spice cooking here. Finally, we've arrived at the big question. What's even the right thing to queue up for Grand Prix Estrathe? Ultimately, there's an easy answer and a hard answer. The easy answer is the most obvious one. Play whatever interests you most. Maybe just jam a couple league matches to make sure you're happy with the deck, then queue it up for the Grand Prix and have fun, win or lose. Now, if you're looking to specifically have fun winning, that's where we have to get precise. There are a couple decks I think are highly likely to wind up in the top 8 of the GP, but I can't confidently say yet what I think will actually win. Let's talk about the biggest decks to be prepared for, the sleeper strategies that may have some potential, the decks that have a little bit of an uphill battle right now, and finally wrap up with the strategy I intend to bring to Grand Prix Estrathe. First off, Golden Age Control. I think this is the big deck to beat on a lot of people's radars right now, owed largely to Kayu's consistent league runs with their changing iterations of the deck. As discussed before, there's a lot of pieces here that can help improve the deck's consistency, and it can grind with the best of the control decks thanks to Harmony producing a profound amount of value alongside some of the best planeswalkers and removal spells in the format. This deck isn't infallible. Remember that while Kaiju has scored 4 successful league runs with the deck, each run came with a match loss in the mix, and 25 lands can result in some draws being a tad too mana flooded to keep up with faster decks that can squeeze in under the answers. But if Golden Age gets a chance to stabilize, the game's uphill from there. Next up is Black-Red Extraction Mission. I think it's one of the most favored decks against Golden Age control, and that will naturally pull people towards it as a result. There's a lot of flexibility here in what creatures you can deem worthwhile. You can run something akin to Lilosaur's most recent league win, or you can skew more aggressive with the enchantments out of the main deck in favor of more high-pressure creatures. You could even jam the greedier list leaning on Extraction Ritual to keep card flow high. There's a diverse array of ways to build this deck, and even if this strategy wins the GP, I think it'll be far from the perfect list, which says a lot for how dynamic and potent this plan can be. Third and final in the list of major decks to be prepared for, in my opinion, is the Graveyard Tempo plan. This list on the screen is my attempt to adjust Stasis's build of the deck, tweaking the mana base slightly and taking advantage of the flex slots in the deck to squeeze in Lurking Virkolakis. There's some solid out-of-the-gate pressure on the table here through the early Feast of Whispered Knives lines, Feast, Apex, and the Rivaling provide a solid amount of reach when the board stalls out. Virkolakis provides some additional main deck graveyard hate, as well as another means of enabling Indulge triggers. Plenty to work with. The sideboard here is speculative, but with all 3 of the top decks kicking around right now caring about their graveyards in some capacity, there's a lot of incentive to pack graveyard hate that isn't completely useless outside of those matchups. Offshoot's a mana-efficient way to hit your opponent's graveyard that can hit your opponent's hand if you have the mana for it, and Conspiracy pulls triple duty by getting you an Indulge trigger, picking away at the opposing graveyard, and giving you a means of hitting your own graveyard when needed. As far as decks that look well positioned in the field without being the top things on people's radar, let's start with the obvious. Tempo looks really promising right now. Sleeper Strix giving us a second relevant 1-mana creature in blue is huge, and Redeveloped Cityscape has done a decent job replacing New Divide in a pinch to help the white splash lineup favorably. Even if you're not looking to splash white, there are plenty of options for other color splashes, and even mono blue could see a lot of success with the right hands. Though it has to look a bit different now with Poisoner and Keeper being changed, there is still some real merit behind jamming something like Kaiju played in his first league run of the season. Protoclast Behemoth is a top-tier card right now if you look to go deeper on your integrate synergies. It dodges Work Safety Violation and any other mana value-specific removal spell in the format right now, while also capitalizing on the overabundance of Redeveloped Cityscape and other ways that opponents are innately putting cards into exile as part of their game plan. I'm really scared of this card specifically for anyone playing the Chittering Gargantua decks, just because of how quickly Gargantua can ramp the Behemoth out for your opponent. This list on screen is by no means perfect. I'm not very experienced with this archetype as well. I simply did what I could to blend Kayu's original mono black list with some of the deeper integrate synergies that I've seen running around the format. That being said, I think there's some real strength behind the strategy that could seriously help it against what's going on in the field right now. Last of the decks that I think are just very well positioned right now is Enchantress. When I spoke with All Who Wander, they spoke to me about the consideration of trimming black to lean harder into Benthelos, an understandable path to take as the token that Benthelos generates preserves its mana value to minimize the impact of an opposing work safety violation. But they also mentioned that ultimately it might hurt the deck to lose the black value generation pieces of Kanai Stone and Thovius, as well as the sideboarded Chronicle of Extinctions. Regardless, the best stack interaction in the format alongside major threats that are hard for the top decks to easily deal with makes this one I'd feel comfortable running up against anything at the top of the field right now. As far as what I'd say would struggle in the tournament, Work Safety Violation, Coup d'etat, and Chronicle of Extinction are doing some heavy lifting right now to keep very creature synergistic decks out of the format. Love of a Lifetime seems to be in a very unfortunate spot right now, as it doesn't do enough on its own to protect your board from an instant speed sweeper off of Get Your Wish, and AO can look really vulnerable if said instant speed sweeper hits the stack before AO can resolve. Similarly, I fear Skittertiller and company in mono green may falter just a bit too much in the face of the powerful interaction the format has right now. It might just get a little too outpaced by the damage potential of the best aggressive decks. There are still less popular aggro plans that can work. see Kilgaris' enchantment aggro list earlier, but your list needs to have a lot of things line up against the current field. I'm also worried for any slower deck that might want to capitalize on graveyard synergies right now, like a proper Reanimator deck, as it's very likely to catch stray graveyard hate meant for Extraction Mission and self-mill tempo. Finally, the counter's synergy decks seem to be in a really poor place for much of the same reasons as mono green. There's some promise in any and all of the decks we've talked about here, and plenty more I haven't even begun to discuss, but ultimately it might be hard to crack through some of the early top strategies we've seen in the format. So what am I playing in all of this? Ultimately, that's something I've been kind of indecisive on. Golden Age looks very promising, and I think it has a strong chance to be this month's big winner, but I suspect that if I register the deck myself, I'm likely to miss out on the top spots due to some lack of experience with the deck compared to some of the other players likely to bring it. What of the other two decks at the top of my list? I have more experience with Graveyard Tempo, but I think the Black-Red Extraction Mission decks are just better positioned in the current field. I'd show you the exact lists I'm looking at between the two archetypes, but I'm genuinely not certain which one will ultimately win out as my deck for the tournament. I could see this going either way, and ultimately I want to make sure you all have this video with enough time to have it help inform you for what to do for yourself. So unfortunately, all I can tell you about my plan for this month is that I'm going to be playing black, and I'm going to care about my graveyard in some capacity. Anything more than that, you'll have to wait and see on Monday. This concludes my guide to Grand Prix Estrathe, the September 2024 tournament for Revolution. I'm excited to see what everyone else is bringing, and I hope whatever I do decide to bring provides us with some fun matches for me to play and you to watch, even if I can't make it to the top cut. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're interested in competing but don't know where to start, please check out the link in the description below to join the Custom Magic Discord community. I promise most of us don't bite. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the tournament.